Welcome back, ladies, gentlemen, and fellow Earthlings, to another episode of the Space Times podcast here with Paul Mayer and Harrison Lambert. We're happy to talk you through this week's latest news, biggest updates, and future-facing facts on the Space Times podcast.
All right, Paul, we've got some exciting news going on this week. Most of it's stuff we've covered before. A lot of news about direct-to-device communications and that whole proliferated communications layer. Some advances in the launch vehicle market. And something new this week is some mentions of space-based interceptors, which we've brought up before with the Golden Dome initiative, but it's getting a lot of traction in this past week with some plans announced by a couple of pretty significant companies. So to start off, we'll cover some pretty big news in the European space market this week regarding the direct-to-device comms networks. Airbus, Leonardo, and Thales Alenia decided to merge their space businesses to create an equal share where Airbus controls 35%, Thales and Leonardo control 32.5% each, and targeted to launch some new technology in the next couple of years by bringing together $6.5 billion in annual revenue to fund the development of advanced communications network, using all their strengths together to really help Europe advance their technology in order to be able to compete primarily with Starlink, which is the primary proliferated communication in operation today.
Yeah, it's a major play and a really impressive effort. Whether or not it'll be successful remains to be seen. Typically, when you see these sort of big collaborative efforts like this, they wind up underperforming just because there's so much money and there are more cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, than can effectively handle that capital. But I've seen Airbus and Thales do well in other joint efforts previously. So I have confidence in their ability to execute here. Interesting, I think, that they're just focusing on the communication layer of things. They're not focusing on any of SpaceX's other vertically integrated capabilities, but potentially a really meaningful player in the space, potentially another really powerful proliferated communication constellation that can deploy and come out. I believe their target launch date, like you said, was late 2027. But they're looking to do this in 18 to 36 months, which is a pretty ambitious timeline.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these companies already have most of the technology needed to deploy these kind of networks. I mean, Airbus already has the Arrow platform, which they use for the OneWeb satellites, and Thales has been building geocom satellites for a while. Leonardo brings its own capabilities across the payload and space architecture fields, so together they'll have a very formidable kind of combination of traits that we haven't really seen out of Europe. I mean, even within America, big companies like Lockheed, Northrop, they're constantly in competition, and there's a very similar kind of environment over in Europe with these companies. So to have them merge together it actually strengthens them quite a bit to actually be able to compete on the level of an American company. And I think the fact that they've traditionally been competitors, but they've all worked within probably a more united environment with the ESA means that they're more likely to be able to function together without too much growing pains in that merger.
Yeah, makes sense. I think there's definitely a layer here from the, I'll say, single point of failure aspect of things, where currently SpaceX owns Starlink, which is largely the only option available on the books. And so for folks whose projects or whose different missions view Starlink as a potential critical point of failure, there could be a lot of incentive to getting some other functionality or some other capability out there on the market. So I'd be very surprised if this joint venture were not also finding some amount of funding from ESA or from various defense organizations throughout Europe who wanted to try and shore up and defense some of those space-based relay, space-based communications that we've seen other countries investing in and announcing investments in over the past several weeks.
Yeah, kind of merging like this, centralizing control over the space industry is pretty risky in terms of redundancy in the supply chain. But I think when they're trying to play catch up the way they are with the U.S. Having pulled away from most of the support, I don't think they're left with much of a choice. I think combining their efforts and really focusing on achieving a lofty goal like this proliferated network system is their best path forward. And we saw it even with smaller mergers just this last week, where Link Global was announced to merge with Omnispace. Now, Link Global has also been working on a direct-to-device system for a while. They've had investments from SES, which is another large telecom operator, and they tried to SPAC just this past year without much success. So it looks like they've kind of run out of their runway and are deciding to join with Omnispace, which is owned by Thales, to become part of that larger effort to combine all this technology into something that can actually be deployed and compete on a global scale.
Yeah, a lot of this is influenced by, I don't want to say reactionary to, but a lot of this is undoubtedly influenced by the SpaceX purchase of EchoStar Spectrum, that $17 billion deal that we announced, or that we talked about last month. That effectively represents SpaceX's attempt to get a foothold in the market and to be first to market and win out a massive chunk of the market share for the direct-to-device communications space. And so seeing Airbus and Thales and Leonardo recognize that direct-to-device is sort of the way that things are going, recognize that, okay, this is the next big massive market that we have. There's a lot of incentive from various government agencies for us to also be a player in there, and to see Link Global and Omnispace announce this merger is all trending in the right direction of direct-to-device being the next big, I'll say, standards battle, the next big opportunity in the space industry that everybody's going to be fighting for. And it looks like the market has already sort of acknowledged and realized that SpaceX is already in the lead, and that Starlink already has a sizable head start, and folks are going to need to work together in order to catch up to them. Speaking of, I think Globalstar explored a potential sale. Reports indicate, what was it, 10 billion? Yeah, 10 billion, 100% premium over current market cap. So market cap at 5 billion, considering a 2x sale, basically. So Globalstar is the company that provides connectivity for Apple's iPhone emergency features, and they were in talks with Apple for a future contract for some of Apple's direct-to-device capabilities. And it sounds like there's maybe some talk of Apple, instead of working with Globalstar for the next generation, working with SpaceX to provide that direct-to-device capability. So there's some talk about whether or not Apple will wind up going with this Globalstar option or going with the SpaceX option, which means Globalstar pursuing or being open to a sale could further consolidate the market, most likely around SpaceX. They're the most likely acquirer of this, to buy up further competition and see it turn into more of a duopoly between the European consortium and SpaceX itself.
It really seems like a continuation of SpaceX just trying to increase their lead. It seems like there's a concerted effort from China and the EU to build up these communications networks to compete with Starlink. But Starlink's so far ahead that it's able to just kind of accrue all these revenue streams to keep building their head start. I mean, like you said, the EchoStar deal at 17 billion was tied to a T-Mobile contract that should get them on that carrier's network. There was a United deal with Starlink just recently to provide in-airplane connectivity through Starlink. That's already been deployed and is functional. There's talks from Elon Musk about building up the chipsets needed for direct-to-device connectivity, that the Starlink terminals in orbit are already capable of this. That is just a matter of the ground-based chips being able to accommodate it. And originally I speculated companies like Qualcomm that were already building out chips for the Chinese PNT and Baidu constellations might be kind of the go-to there, but it's, iPhone is definitely a potential player. Apple builds their own chips. They've already built out chips for that Globalstar connectivity. And it could be that, either Apple's unhappy with Globalstar's capabilities and Globalstar is trying to take this out to kind of bring in money, or potentially SpaceX could go on a buying spree and buy Globalstar too and just add Apple to their, their repository of companies that they're working with and just take these giant leaps forward in their competitiveness in their market. I mean, 100% premium on a sale is kind of cocky. Like, it's pretty confident to say that we're worth twice as much when you really only have a limited constellation in orbit. It really only provides like SOS services to iPhone and some other connectivity stuff, but hard to say it's worth that much money.
Well, typically when you see a premium on an acquisition like this, what that typically means is that the sale is to an acquirer. The sale is to somebody for whom the asset being acquired is more valuable than the independent sum of its parts, which means that this would be being sold to a direct competitor. This would be sold to somebody for whom Globalstar is a link in their supply chain. This is being sold to somebody for whom having that actual business is worth more than just the cash flows of the business itself. So that's pretty typical to see a premium like that played in. The quantity or the amount of that premium can vary a little bit, but a 50% premium is, generally speaking, that's relatively low. Paying 50% over market for something like that, paying 100% over market like that certainly isn't off base or wildly off target. So I do think that there's some sort of confidence there, some confidence for sure on the end that if they're pursuing something with 100% premium, that the buyer is pretty confident that this is going to wind up being accretive. And frankly, this is what corporate strategy as defense looks like. This is what it looks like for a corporation to defend their market from new entrants and from smaller incumbents. This is the corporate game at scale, effectively.
So you think they're selling to ward something off, or because I take this as EchoStar just sold for $17 billion, maybe somebody want to buy us for the same kind of money, but I can't think of anybody that can afford that besides SpaceX. Maybe Kuiper.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. The list of folks who have $10 billion to spare is pretty short. I do think you probably listed both of them. But what this reads to me is more of a company that received an offer or got some sort of cocktail napkin suggestion for an acquisition, rather than a company that's necessarily trying to cash in or cash out based on somebody else's exit. That could entirely be the case, but it's sort of just as likely that, hey, so-and-so just sold and got out, they left the game, we should probably consider the same. This other third party has made sort of a soft offer or implied that maybe there would be an offer there. We think that this would be fair. Why don't we try and sort of float that a little bit? So I think a little bit of column A that they're reading the market and maybe considering getting out. A little bit of column B that maybe they're releasing this in response to some interest. But either way, Globalstar exiting the market represents a pretty sizable amount of consolidation in the market.
I was going to say, it's interesting that the American market seems to be consolidating around the business side, around the regulatory spectrum side of things, while EU is just consolidating around the manufacturing. It very much seems like the US is a stage ahead of where the EU is, and just trying to consolidate the applications that they can actually deploy through their already deployed network of satellites. So the other big moves this week have been in the launch vehicle segment. We've discussed in the previous weeks, but there's some big big action. There were some big events that happened across the European launch environment, across the Chinese launch environment. There's a little bit of movement in the American market, but they're constantly launching stuff at this point. So it's really seeing EU and China playing catch up. One of the big things to come out of EU this week was a raise of $52 million in a Series A by HyImpulse. This was led by the Campus Founders Venture, and it's to scale their hybrid engines for the European PLS. This is kind of coming off the back of the announcement of some large investments by Germany. HyImpulse is a German launch vehicle company. There's a couple of other launch vehicle companies, Rocket Factory Augsburg and ISAR Aerospace. So I would expect to see these kind of large raises happening soon for these companies, just off of anticipation of them winning a large chunk of this, I believe, $6 billion German contract, or I think it might have been hundreds of billions.
Germany has committed a massive amount of money. The number top of my mind, it was hundreds of billions, but could be wrong on that. But Germany has absolutely committed a massive amount of money to the space defense industry sector. And so I think, as we've spoken and alluded to before, that launch is sort of the bedrock of the space industry, that's where so much of the industry ends up deriving from. So it would make perfect sense that a lot of the launch providers in Germany and in Europe are experiencing some swells of support as, hey, that's $100 billion is a heck of a lot of money. 100 billion euros is a heck of a lot of money that's got to go somewhere. And so it would make perfect sense that these various launch providers would be some of the major beneficiaries of that targeted investment, especially because, as we've spoken about before, how much Europe's launch ecosystem sort of lags behind that of America's. And so Arianespace and the incumbent traditional launchers that we have that have been servicing Europe in the past are fabulous, and we're big fans of them, but there's some definite room for improvement, and it looks like some of that extra capability and capacity is what we're seeing gain momentum.
Yeah, and it looks very similar to the early days of the U.S. launch market. Back in the early or late 2000s, early 2010s, when there were a bunch of launch vehicle companies kind of working on different techs to try to improve launch capability. I mean, we've talked in the previous weeks about Avio getting a lot of money to do some reusable upper stages, some solid boosters, some landing in the ocean work. There was a new launch pad out of Sweden that was opened with the ESA doing some hot tests there to test the reusability. And now we're seeing this investment in HyImpulse for hybrid engines. So it looks like there's money kind of flowing around to a bunch of different technologies. I would hope that the anticipation is those all get pulled together into one, or at least into a lineup of launch vehicles that they could use to, kind of reach this next generation of reusability that SpaceX has already reached, and that a lot of other companies are a lot closer to. I think China is taking a very similar approach. It just seems like they're more coordinated amongst all their companies. I think part of that is the fact that the government has a controlling factor in all these companies, and Europe doesn't. And so maybe they're a bit more well coordinated. But we're seeing something very similar where, Space Pioneers just this week readying the Tianlong 3 for a static fire. This is a reusable rocket engine, as well as CASC is testing a Long March 10 reusable rocket. So China's already ready to fly a couple of reusable rockets. So already they're a lot closer to being able to compete with the US space capability, particularly SpaceX Falcon 9. And kind of like the EU, they have Orion Space testing sea splashdown recovery. So that was similar to how Aviospace last week partnered to develop that capability as well. So it seems like there's a lot of parallels between the EU and the Chinese space markets in terms of developing these reusability features. But I think what's really going to come down to is how well they can pull that all together into one cohesive launch vehicle, or one cohesive lineup of launch vehicles.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment of the situation. A lot of the different layers, a lot of the different stacks of launch at this point have already been solved. And so it's more about orchestrating and piecing together the best solutions rather than rather than reinventing the wheel from the ground up and doing everything fresh on your own. And so seeing both of these efforts partnering with Orion Space for the sea splashdown aspect is a perfect example of that sort of, we'll say, horizontal specialization throughout the launch market.
Yeah, and I'll be curious to see if this is the right approach. I mean, one of the key things that stood out for SpaceX throughout their development, of years, is that they were very vertically integrated and they had control over the entire stack of technology. And I think that's proven to be very valuable to them. On the flip side, there's a company like Rocket Lab where they acquired most of the technology, either their solar panels or their reaction wheels or their flight software. They mostly bought it from other companies. So kind of like these other space environments like EU and China, they took technology from a bunch of different companies and pulled it together into a functioning launch vehicle. I mean, the Electron's been launching. They're working on the Neutron. The Electron just won 10 more launches for Synspective, just a Japanese constellation of radar imaging satellites. And that's on the back of 10 of those satellites that they're already planning to launch through the next 2 years. So obviously there's some success there, but it's just interesting to see the scale of their success. Having 20 satellites to launch, probably tens of millions of dollars for that kind of satellite. But we have somebody like SpaceX, who just getting 5 military contracts for next year is bringing in $714 million. And this is very standard for them at this point. It's just 5 Falcon launches. Like, this is what they do. And that's a lot of money to bring in. So it seems like the approach that SpaceX took, where they're able to kind of consolidate all the technology in-house, build it themselves, have that vertical integration, might be a more beneficial way to approach this. But we'll have to see how it plays out with these other countries in this kind of fragmented approach.
Yeah, typically what you see as a piece of technology or as an industry matures is you see, broadly speaking, a shift from vertical integration to horizontal integration, effectively saying that SpaceX and their model of doing everything end-to-end themselves, that's typically how you get started in the industry. And that's mostly because there's nobody else doing this. So you're the best in the world at whatever it is you're doing because there's nobody else doing any aspect of this throughout the world. As time goes on, other folks are going to learn from you, folks are going to copy you legally and some less legally, but of course folks are going to learn from you and stand on the shoulders of giants, and you're going to have folks who leave the company and go off and build their own exciting and amazing products. And so what you end up seeing is a lot of specialization in the space over time. And so SpaceX, despite having done this for, I think, 15, 20 years at this point, but SpaceX, for all their success, has been doing this for a long time. And there has been a whole ecosystem that has grown up effectively in the shadows of what SpaceX has built. And so I think, sort of to your point, what you're pointing out is that these sort of federal government contracts are always going to be pointed towards the most reliable or most risk assuaged solution. And at this point, that is 100% SpaceX. It's going to be a while until we reach a point where any of the other players have reached that level of competency and have reached that level of reliability and safety to where it's a pick-em choice, a coin flip between government agencies. Government agencies and government customers typically prefer capability first and everything else second. So just buying the best capability, buying the best quality is what's necessary for the mission. And so, SpaceX has been able to do that because they've been so vertically integrated. But over time, we can expect to see that sort of premium for a vertically integrated approach start to get eaten away by more horizontal specialization, by folks who specialize at sort of each layer. And we're already seeing that in other markets that don't have a SpaceX or SpaceX equivalent currently sort of playing defense and trying to maintain their market share. So I think sort of to your point, SpaceX has done a great job of getting to where they are, and they're doing a great job and likely will continue to do a great job of maintaining that position. for a large point, but I think we can look to Europe and I think we can look to China to see more of a representative for a more matured industry where there's a lot of different players and everybody has sort of their own area, their own niche or niche of expertise that they can bring to the table and bring to bear. And so the engineering and the technical requirements and needs wind up being more akin to those of systems level engineering than they are more deep tech or more specialized propulsion or physical or mathematical expertise.
Yeah, we talk a lot about launch vehicles, but this week it's kind of funny that we're able to talk about something going the opposite direction. I mean, typically we would only talk about things going up, but maybe within the past week we started being able to talk about stuff coming back down. It hasn't really been a thing since the Star Wars program back in the 80s under Reagan that anybody's wanted to bring stuff down from space, besides just for deorbiting. But last week we talked about the Arc spacecraft from Inversion, and this week we actually have two different companies talking about space-based interceptors, which is the friendly way of talking about space-based missiles. These things that we would deploy from space in order to strike somewhere on Earth. But both of these companies are talking about striking missiles being launched. So obviously in the context of the Golden Dome Initiative and the Proliferated Warfighter Network, missile defense, in this case, includes being able to actually strike the missile after it's been detected from launch. So separately this week, Apex announced Project Shadow to demonstrate their space-based interceptor by launching the Orbital magazine within a year. And this is on the back of them raising $200 million. So, it seems a safe conclusion that a lot of that money was raised in order to pursue this technology. They're one of the first out of the gate saying or committing to actually developing this technology because the Golden Dome Initiative is still in its infancy. There hasn't really been any contract requests go out, and none of the tranches in the Proliferated Warfighter Network call for a space-based interception technology. So they're really betting big on this being a key technology that's going to bring in a lot of the money from that Golden Dome Initiative, which is like $1.3 trillion. So investing any portion of $200 million in order to get a solid crack at a $1.3 trillion contract seems like a pretty good bet. Granted, it's a pretty nascent company, so big bet could take them out if they don't do it right. And especially when they're competing with a juggernaut like Lockheed Martin, who's announced the same initiative but on a longer time scale to have something deployed by 2028. I think Lockheed makes a lot of sense for this kind of technology as well. They even 2 weeks ago launched their first tranche of Terran orbital satellites for the Proliferated Warfighter Network. So they're positioned pretty well to take advantage of this missile defense network because they're already working on it. So they're kind of upfront positioned better to add to it with this space-based interceptor technology.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, one of the things that we've started to see a lot of in the investing side of the fence is the proliferation of returning assets from orbit, and in conjunction with that, space-based, I'll say, interception, both of objects that are traveling to destinations in space and of objects traveling to terrestrial destinations. And so there's absolutely a growing awareness and a need for this. And a lot of this is probably, to your point, driven by the Missile Defense Agency, driven by MDA, driven by Golden Dome, driven by the new space race, the new Star Wars initiative. And some of the technical challenges associated with orbital-based defenses or orbital-based interceptors is the simple fact that all of our current on-orbit propulsion solutions are either chemical propulsion or electrical propulsion, or some small hybrid of chemical and electrical that amounts to plasma, but it's all the same ballpark. And we're talking about thrust vectors on the order of magnitude of 100 pounds force down to fractions of a pound force. And the reason that we have to play in numbers that small is because there's a lot of difficulty in effectively in keeping a rocket on orbit safely for a long period of time. There's a couple of different ways that you can go about solving this problem. You could try and put a nuclear reactor in space. That'll be able to generate a whole bunch of power infinitely, but you don't have to imagine very hard to think of the potential challenges of a nuclear reactor in low Earth orbit and something going wrong. Pretty obvious that would be pretty catastrophic. So we can scratch that off the list pretty quickly. And then the challenges with putting rockets up there in orbit that can stay up there in orbit is that you've basically got solid fuel boosters, you've got liquid fuel boosters, and then you've got hybrid boosters. And the solid fuel boosters, we don't really have a way to start or stop them. For the most part, a solid fuel rocket booster, you start it and it goes until it's empty. There's not, once you pop, you can't stop. There's not really a way to throttle that or turn that off. So if you want to or need to go from point A to B and then wait, and then go from point B to C and then wait, solid rocket boosters don't do a great job of that. The challenge with liquid rocket boosters is that the cryo environment of being on orbit for extended periods of time is really demanding. It is cold. Turns out space is pretty darn cold. And that's a really tough technical challenge to solve. Then the hybrid rocket solutions use a little bit of both, hence the name. But the challenge that they're experiencing is that for the most part, hybrid rockets were never really invested in or developed traditionally because solid rocket boosters and pure liquid rocket boosters did the job better from surface to orbit. And so the combination of the two distinct and separate pure liquid and pure solid boosters was always preferred. So there was never really a need for a third sort of hybrid booster where we could get 80% of the capability of one of the two of these. Never really arose. So unfortunately, at this stage, the hybrid rocket technology just isn't as mature as we need in order to sort of see these solutions. So all of this to say that there's a bunch of different solutions in the space, and they're really interesting. But the idea of having effectively a defense or a sentry drone in orbit waiting to be deployed that's able to then deploy thousands of pound force of thrust in order to protect an asset in space if there's an adversarial asset headed to try and disrupt or destroy that our target asset that we want to defend, or if for whatever reason there's another reason to do that, we have a really agile, really capable solution on orbit to do that. So getting these on orbit, I'll say, interceptor solutions is very much recognized by the Golden Dome, by MDA, and by the larger industry in general, that the problems that need to be solved, the physics and technical problems that need to be solved in providing that capability will open a whole lot of doors. Because if you're able to sit around on orbit and wait, then you're able to sit around on orbit and wait, which means you can hang out up there and you can deorbit something if necessary. You can grab a hold of it, move it around as necessary, and bring it back down if necessary. So companies like Stoke Space, like Lexiterna, the companies playing in the on-orbit service industry, they are all very much sort of direct second-order beneficiaries of this type of persistent on-orbit thrust capacity, I'll say. But yeah, I think Lockheed is a big potential player to jump into a place like this. Having spoken with multiple different representatives of Lockheed, this is something that they're very interested in, and they're interested throughout the entirety of the TRL, of the technical readiness level layers. Typically, Lockheed focuses a little bit later on in the stack for stuff that's a little bit more mature, but they're so interested in it that they're also, Lockheed Martin Ventures is looking at much more nascent stuff as well.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they still have the designs from the 80s and they just spin that up and launch it. But I mean, this technology is odd. The benefits of having an interceptor in space are pretty minimal. I mean, your delta V is a huge problem in terms of like getting a rocket from space to hit a rocket going through the air. Usually, there's multiple layers to ground-based defense, and Lockheed knows this very well. Most of it's long range and mid range, short range disablement of rockets. So I'm not really sure where this would sit. I mean, clearly long range, but where would you need to put these satellites in order for them to be able to interdict on any like rapid turnaround? The network you would have to be low enough that it could reach the Earth quickly, but that means that it's moving around quite a bit, so you need quite a few of them just storing missiles in space. And that's not even getting to the political aspect of it, of having nations storing things that are orbiting overhead that could strike the ground just as easily as they could strike a missile. It's only up to what they're claiming it can do. And I think what Apex is doing is probably just positioning themselves to be able to take in that money from that technology and use it to kind of build out a broader capability throughout the Golden Dome kind of structure. I think in the long term, companies like Lockheed will still have the advantage just off of having a long-standing history of having like ground-based missile interception devices like the THAAD missile system. And I think the one that hasn't said anything, but I would bet we'll say something soon, is Firefly, having bought SciTech last week for $700 million, I believe, or off the back of their $700 million raise. That gives them a company that's great at missile detection, and it's combining it with their history of the Victus missions where they've had fast turnarounds of their rockets. So, having a combination between a company that's good at detecting missiles from space and a company that's good at launching rockets within short notice, 24 hours, but they could probably bring that down to the point where they could react to missiles. They seem like another player that could leap at this opportunity as well.
Sure.
It's not just the U.S. that's putting large amounts of money towards these space shield initiatives like Golden Dome. Europe's doing the same thing. They're announcing $800 billion in defense investment for the space shield, which is meant to be a space-based radar and optical system for situational awareness and resilience against missile and cyber threats. So very similar to the Golden Dome, but none of that language about space-based interceptors. So it'll be interesting to see if that gets added to the plan for Space Shield. It's very close to the amount of money we're spending, $800 billion to $1.3 trillion. Like together, that's over $2 trillion of money just flying around for space-based missile defense.
Yeah, not to correct you here, but the article I saw was 800 billion euro for this, which is closer to $1 trillion USD. But yeah, very much to your point that that Europe has banded together and they have very much allocated a massive defense spending budget in order to build. I believe they are calling it the Space Shield, but with some minor changes, I think pointing to sort of the Golden Dome is a great comparison. They're absolutely investing in the defense there. Some other business moves from the past week or so here. We've got a couple of different fundraising announcements. Quilter raised $25 million Series B, led by Index Ventures, to anonymously print circuit boards, and Hughes Network System announced the acquisition of Anderson Connectivity, who does the same. So there's some movement and some acquisition in the PCB sector, which is one of the earliest stages of on-orbit avionics. So we are seeing some movement and some consolidation there.
And it's something we've talked about in the past couple of weeks, is the improvements needed for manufacturing, especially in comparison to China's capability. And PCB development, electronic development is a huge choke point, not just in supply chains, but just in the design and development of these space platforms. So having some money flow in there would be a huge boon to our manufacturing capabilities.
Yeah, it's good to see. This is absolutely a net positive. Additionally, Planet Labs just announced hair shy of 13 million NGA contract for maritime domain awareness, which we love to see. I believe that's on the back of a similar contract awarded to Muon Space for climate observation that we discussed previously as well.
Yeah, that was a NASA contract for data as a service, but they're both environmental monitoring contracts. So seeing, I think the last one was 60 million, this one's 12.8 million. So tens of millions of dollars coming from multiple agencies to fund environmental programs is good to see.
Yeah, 16 and 12 million respectively is certainly a meaningful contribution. Let's see, what else do we have here? Additionally, NGXSat raised 1.4 million seed for their satellite modems. You were excited about this one.
Yeah, it's NXGSat, but they're building space satellite modems. I'm really interested to see how this one goes. It's only a $1.4 million raise, but it is their seed, so they're very early on. Obviously, there's a lot of implications for this whole proliferated communication network and direct-to-device constellations. But just in general, like RF modems are one of the most fragile to radiation devices on a spacecraft. So having development here would be great, not just for Earth or space to Earth connection, but just in general RF development.
Yeah, that's one of the things sort of on the conference circuit this year was that darn near every engineering shop that was represented at these different events, their opener, their introduction was, "Hi, pleasure to meet you. We do radiation shielding for hardware." So it's everybody who wasn't building a satellite, everybody who wasn't building a payload seemed to be actively trying to protect the payload from radiation shielding. So there's a lot of folks trying to solve this problem, because having a more reliable RF capability is probably the single easiest sort of snap one's fingers solution that we could make to providing an excess of capability on orbit. But something that I thought was really interesting, AST Space Mobile just announced a $1 billion convertible note raise due in 2036. So what this means is that they're raising a whole bunch of money by selling convertible notes that they will either buy back or will convert into equity by the end of 2036. So it's a massive raise, and it is candidly, it's a huge gamble on AST's part that they're going to be able to stick the landing on the other side, that they're going to be able to transition this into some really meaningful revenue, because selling $1 billion in equity isn't going to end well for anybody, but effectively selling $1 billion of debt could work well for everybody. Yeah. So different sources of capital in space companies are hard to come by. Generally speaking, space only sees sort of equity sales come in. That's what you see with venture capital. That's what you see with angel investment. That's what you see with convertible notes. More typically are an avenue for purchasing and selling equity. And so what it sounded like AST Space Mobile was doing was selling these convertible notes with a dividend, with some sort of interest rate, effectively, with the full intent of paying back the convertible note with that interest before the 2036 conversion date, which, if that sounds like a loan, that's because in effect that's a loan. So interesting to see AST Space and Mobile manage to find a way to get some debt into the system there, and potentially gain the benefits of a whole bunch of capital without needing to sell off that much equity.
Yeah, I think it's based on the fact that their stock does so well, but they have a long way to go for their technology. So the convertible note is the interesting part to me. I think it'll still hurt their stock price, but it doesn't dilute as bad as if they just sold equity. So that's a lot of money to raise. I mean, that's like how much OneWeb got from SoftBank. So that kind of order of magnitude to build out a whole constellation. AST's already got some satellites on orbit, and they've got some contracts with Verizon and AT&T. So they've already got a foot in the door, but this really seems like them trying to accelerate stuff on the back of good stock performance.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely opportunistic. They're definitely taking advantage of the fact that their stock has been doing well and that they've been executing well. But the fact that things don't convert for 11 calendar years is pretty indicative that this isn't sort of a buy now, pay later approach to things, but it's indicative that they are very confident that they will be able to execute with this $1 billion. They'll be able to execute to the point where they're able to, by one mean or another, effectively pay back that loan. Yeah. Even if it's not a loan, even if it's technically, if it's equity, they'll be able to find a way to sort of buy back those equity shares to be able to protect their shareholders and to be able to protect everybody who's been involved with them so far. But that's obviously where their confidence comes in. Whether or not they'll be able to do that is another question altogether. But they've been doing well so far, so good for them for making that much progress. Additionally, here, Hawkeye 360 raised 10 million, and AnySignal raised 5 million, both to develop more RF communication and mapping technologies. Hawkeye 360 on the RF mapping satellites and analytic tool sets, and AnySignal on the RF communications hardware and signal security software. And finally, Momentus filed to sell 44 million shares of common stock, which, generally speaking, for a early stage company to sell common stock is that's got to be a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, it's their stock prices are kind of opposite of AST Space Mobile, not doing too well. It's about $1 a share, so that should raise them around 40 million a share, but likely tank their stock price and get them under $1, which would cause them to delist. But every time that's about to happen, they do a reverse stock split. So I'm honestly surprised if they're able to get this much money from this action, but it does seem like potentially enough to keep them alive long enough to launch Vigoride 7, which we spoke about last week. They've got a third major contract on that spacecraft to demonstrate some on-orbit structure deployment and in-space resource utilization. So, given their history of flying large solar structures, I think this is a move to try to display some of that capability of large on-orbit structures and some autonomous functionality, which has been a pretty sought-after technology across multiple companies recently. I mean, we've spoken about quite a few of them working on autonomous and RPO demonstrations. So, this is the amount of money that'll hopefully get them to the point where they're able to demonstrate that on orbit.
Yeah, and to Momentus's credit, saying that an earlier stage company selling common stock is generally a sign of challenges ahead. To Momentus's credit, they've navigated and weathered the challenges incredibly well. The fact that they are still listed and have been navigating the hurdles that they have, it speaks to the capabilities of leadership to problem solve sort of on the fly with these different financial institutions and these different financial instruments that they've been leveraging to keep the lights on and continue making progress and executing towards their milestones. So full credit to them. Full credit to them as they make progress and move forward.
Yeah, I wanted to circle back to the two RF ones real quick. And Hawkeye 360 raising some money is pretty standard. It looks like it's just continuing what they're already doing. So there's a little money to help them develop their RF capabilities. But AnySignal is an interesting one to watch. 5 million is pretty low, but I think it's pretty early for them. But they're using it to work on signal security software, which is actually a really important part of the proliferated warfighter network. A lot of companies have to take it into account when they're developing their communications network, especially when they're being used for military applications. So the technology they could develop could be very useful to a lot of companies and just have important role in the larger kind of proliferated warfighter network, proliferated communications networks that we've been talking about. So for some of the tech advances that don't really have a business aspect attached to them, there's some cool stuff going on in space this past week. The one that's got me most excited is the United States Space Force is launching their presumably ninth, or they've claimed their ninth mission. I'm pretty sure this number jumps all over the place every time I read it. I think that they've launched many more than this, but they're saying this is their ninth X-37B mission.
Ninth felt right.
Yeah.
Ninth is what felt right today.
I could have sworn like 2 weeks ago I saw it was like the 16th, so I don't know what kind of mind games they're playing, but it's working. Whatever mission this is, they're launching the X-37B, which is their secretive space plane, to test out a couple of really interesting technologies. A high bandwidth intersatellite laser comm device, which, as we talked about endlessly, is a really important technology being developed by a ton of companies just these days. So for them for the U.S. military to test this technology, I'm going to figure it's a huge leap forward in some capability. When they say high bandwidth, that's a very promising indication that there will be some very interesting improvements to this technology in the coming years. The other technology that's being tested is a quantum inertial sensor. So this uses a quantumly locked atom using interferometry to measure inertial movement. So typically acceleration, velocity for rotational measurement, but potentially also for GPS uses, so they can measure translational motion as well.
Yeah.
Most likely it's just to do interpolative kind of measurements to measure and kind of augment the systems that already exist. But regardless, even if it's just for rotational measurement, these sensors typically have a lot less noise and random walk to them, and just are a lot more reliable, so you can get a higher pointing capability out of your spacecraft, which, funny enough, is really important for these missile defense systems, which, laser comms are also important for. So both these technologies play into the larger trends we're seeing with the defense network.
Do we know who either of the providers of the hardware or the technology being demonstrated or flown are?
I saw that it was colleges. So I think it's research projects partnered with the colleges.
Oh, very
they're
interesting.
like secretive, so they don't say like who and what is working on it.
Right.
But I did see some stuff about like Stanford or Columbia.
Could very well be they could very well be hacking for defense program classes, partnering with colleges to run through the technical and business diligence of them.
Yeah, I can't remember if I saw it for this mission or just some X-37B mission, but I'm pretty sure most of these are like, partnered through a university or some secretive company. Star Cloud. Oh, actually, on the same kind of topic, we have Muon planning to fly the Starlink Placer system on its Halo satellite platform. So this is the inter-satellite laser communication device that Starlink uses to communicate between their platforms. I'd always thought that this was very designed specifically to Starlink, but the fact that they're able to provide it to another company like Muon to fly on their spacecraft, so that spacecraft can connect into the broader Starlink platform, is really interesting, because it potentially jumpstarts any company that doesn't have a hang up about owning the entire network to allow them to connect into a proliferated network. So having these Muon satellites being able to connect through laser comms to a constantly on network that can get that information down to the ground, the responsivity of that satellite is going to be incredible. I mean, Muon is a kind of generalized platform, so they can fly just about anything. But as we've talked over the past couple of weeks, like, they've been getting a lot of attention for FireSat, for some environmental data as a service. Like, that lends a lot of credence to that data as a service contract, because if they're able to get the data very responsibly through like that proliferated network, that makes it way more valuable, especially in the FireSat context. Like, being able to communicate fires quickly is one of the key aspects to that, and they don't have to worry about the entire constellation to bring that capability online. So this is really cool that they're doing this.
This is one of the primary value adds that Kuiper the Kuiper constellation is sort of selling, that access or connection to the network gets from anywhere, gets you everywhere effectively. And so Muon is demonstrating that Starlink is capable of providing the same or very similar value adds to their customers as well. So there's a clear capabilities arms race here, which we should all love to see.
Yeah. A weird one, StarCloud is flying the NVIDIA H100 next month as a test for orbital data centers. This is kind of an idea that we've not been the biggest fans of in the past, just for like numerous engineering reasons. It never really makes sense. But if NVIDIA is able to make a processor that doesn't consume or that doesn't generate too much heat and can operate relatively efficiently from a power standpoint, then maybe this is a moment where we're proven wrong and data centers are more viable. But it's really up to NVIDIA being able to make the technology make sense.
I mean, at the end of the day, a data center requires power for operation, and it requires cooling, and the cooling itself also has some power requirements. So the clear sort of cocktail napkin value for a space-based data center is that we've got free power and you've got free cooling. Space is really cold and the sun is right there. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not anybody is able to actually solve that. I've seen about a dozen different companies trying to solve this and claiming that they're able to solve this, but nobody's actually got any sort of launch demo on orbit. Nobody's actually gotten anything up to prove out that F equals ma on this sort of thing yet. So it'll be interesting to see what the performance data for NVIDIA's H100 is and how that actually impacts some of the design criteria and some of the calculations that we see.
Yeah, we've seen some GPUs be flown on space, but they haven't been very popular yet. So to see them trying to scale it up to the level of a data center suggests, quite a bit of faith in the possibility of this being useful. NVIDIA is saying the H100 is 100 times more capable than any other processor flown in space. So, it seems like this is a major leap forward in the technology. It'll just be interesting to see if this makes much difference in the feasibility of this use case. JAXA this week launched the HTVX. This is a Mitsubishi Heavy manufactured large capacity cargo spacecraft capable of carrying 6,000 kilograms. So this will be useful for on-orbit habitats, large space structures, that sort of thing. We've seen some of this recently with like the Cygnus XL. So this is kind of Japan's answer to that. Very useful for the ISS, but potentially future habitats that are being considered now. The Rocket Lab has also completed spacecraft for a cryogenic fueling mission in that kind of space habitat region. This is meant to be a test for on-orbit fuel depot that is partnered with ETA Space and NASA. So it'll be cool to see if they're able to test out this cryogenic fueling storage and actually like interlink refueling system, since this is a technology that would be really neat to have for extending lifetime of spacecraft, extending the distance that we can travel for interplanetary space travel. And I think the wildest news I heard this week was that Reflect Orbital plans to launch Earendil-1, which will be a system of 4,000 space mirrors that will redirect sunlight on demand. The idea being that they'll set them at the Terminator line in orbit, and at twilight they can point some of the sun down to Earth-based solar panels and generate extra power. Just besides the fact of like, does that even make you that much more money, or like, this is just solar power we're talking about? That's a lot of stuff to launch into space. That not only like 4,000 space mirrors are not only just a bunch of stuff floating around in space, and that's going to be a very large structure, likely very low in orbit, but it's also very bright. There's been constant complaints about Starlink interfering with astronomy. Like this is intentionally going to be so much worse.
Yeah, it's easily the simultaneously the most ambitious, the silliest, and the most fun of all of these ideas. And there are a lot of benefits to developing the capability and solving the problems, but developing the capability and the technology to get reliable, accurate, controllable mirrors on orbit or past low Earth orbit, but point being that being able to sort of control the sun and control where the sun is hitting in space is one of the most valuable problems to solve. Whether or not Reflect Orbital is a solved business case that proves out that technical capability, or whether this is something else entirely, remains to be seen. But I think this is one that we should keep an eye on and absolutely keep launching, because it is so unique for so many reasons.
I mean, it's a cool technology that we want to have, like better solar generation is good for everyone. It just, the design to me seems immature. Like they could have thought it a bit more through. It feels very simple. It reminds me of that like mirror solar panel down in LA that just cooks birds, and that's all it does. Like Starcatcher had their announcement probably about a month ago with their funding and their missions. Like they've already flown and demonstrated that they can redirect sunlight to the ground for solar power, and their system uses like lenses to redirect stuff. So it seems like a much more thought through kind of design than this. But you know, I'll take whichever one works, fly both of them, see how they do. You know, whichever can get us some improved efficiency for solar generation is a benefit to all of our energy needs on Earth.
Well, I think the longer term benefits of getting, I'll say, space mirror capability, getting space mirror technology, is not to reflect sunlight back to Earth, but to concentrate and reflect sunlight into whatever sort of space vehicle or space-based battery that needs to collect the sunlight. So it's more about energy storage and transmission in orbit and in and past orbit. But finding an orbital terrestrial solution for this does, to your point, feel a little bit forced. That there's probably a simpler and more straightforward way to cut this cake, not to undermine or mitigate the value of good quote unquote space mirror technology.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they can pivot to Golden Dome 2 and just start shooting down enemy satellites instead. That's all this week for the Space Times podcast. I've been Harrison Lambert here with Paul Mayer. We're glad you joined us in our little corner of the universe to listen to the news from this week. We hope you enjoyed, and will join us again next week.